The Long Voyage Back, page 374. We're getting really close to the end, guys. Thanks for watching. As they sailed on toward the equator, the heat and humidity became stupefying. Only the recurrent squalls, by refreshing their supply of water, kept them alive and sane. All Neil felt he dared do for Frank was give him a second blood transfusion, but with the plague victims it was an hourly battle to try to cool off their bodies. The seawater was 20 degrees cooler than the air, and they used it continually. But over the next 3 days the fever raged on. Twice Lisa went into convulsions. Twice she recovered. Jim jabbered on in some otherworldly hallucination about snow and cold and the bottom of the world, sometimes giggling hysterically. On the third day, after Lisa had had her second bout of convulsions, Neil came down into the cabin and found Jean up on the berth with Lisa, her face buried on Lisa's bare back and neck, sobbing. For a moment, Neil thought that Lisa must have died. A wave of sadness immobilised him. Then he noticed her rapid, shallow breathing and realised that Jean, who had been driving herself beyond reason, was suddenly giving up. Pressing her face and mouth against Lisa's flesh was almost a kind of suicide. He went up to the edge of the berth, gently pulled her back toward him, and, as she wailed and struggled, less gently dragged her out of the cabin. With Ollie and Sheila watching uncertainly, he took soap and seawater and scrubbed her face, neck and arms. She struggled and cried like a child being punished. Neil even forced the soap rag inside her mouth before finally letting go. "Take her back to her own cabin," he said quietly to Sheila. "Keep her there. I'll take over responsibility for Jim and Lisa until Jean's rested." Back below decks, when he felt Lisa's forehead, he was horrified. He had never felt a human body so hot. He dispensed with the side cockpit pool and towels and instead began throwing buckets of seawater directly over Lisa and Jim, and the towels and clothing that wrapped their naked bodies. For half an hour he lugged the buckets down and poured the cool seawater over them. Later he'd have to bail out the cabin's bilge. 40 minutes later he went to see Jean in her cabin. She was alone, and after asking how she was and receiving a dull reply, he said to her, "I miss you, Jean." "Miss me?" she said, looking puzzled. "Oh," she added, understanding. "I know of no law saying I can't love you," he said. "Do you?" "No," she replied, not looking at him. "Nor a law prohibiting your loving me," he went on. "Is there?" Her face still averted, she said, "Only a law of nature." "What law is that?" "When a mother is threatened with the loss of a child, she loses a part of herself." "I see," said Neil. "That I can't help." "Nor can I," said Jean. "And I still miss you." "I know," she whispered. "There are no barriers between us now," Neil said gently, "except those we erect in our own hearts." "I know," she whispered again, crying softly, "but I can't knock them down." "But what are they?" Neil asked gently. She looked up at him at last, warm tears in her eyes. "Fear," she said. "Fear? We're all doomed," she said. "No matter how hard we try, one by one we're going to die. Our desperate acts are just dancing on a hot griddle before the end." For a long moment he held her gaze, searching for words of reassurance, searching for the incantation that would smash the barrier. He could find none. "Still," he finally managed, "dancing is better than nothing." "Until you get tired," she responded. Although Frank felt better on the morning after the jet attack, some strangely detached part of him knew he was going to die. It wasn't any rational conclusion based on medical or anatomical knowledge. It was some previously uncontacted part of himself informing him that for some unknown world of reality which, paradoxically, he didn't believe in. A mystic certainty had come to him, Frank, the most unmystical of men. When the heavy sedation Neil had given him began to wear off, and his mind began to clear, Frank was surprised at how he felt. His anger against Neil and his jealousy was totally gone. His earlier decision to abandon Jim, Jean and his friends seemed totally senseless. He knew it had come out of his resentment and sadness at losing Jean, but to his new way of looking at things, losing Jean seemed as trivial an event as losing an anchor. The thought of her, even now, made his heart ache, but the ache was somehow amusing, trivial, like hiccups. Even his own death had a somewhat comic quality, wrestling with one big clown, being shot at by a small one, surviving megatons of destruction to succumb to a tiny piece of lead. Jim's death, if Jim was going to die, was not comic. It was sad. It was the only thing that made him truly sad. It was the only thing that had made him resent the war, resent the Holocaust. Jim should live. Lisa should live. Children should live. It was he and Neil and Ollie and Philip and their generation that had let things happen. They could die knowing they deserved it, but not their children. We are the one generation in human history to snuff out untold millions, no, billions of lives of all creatures for untold centuries. We are the assholes that let it happen. For even as he accepted his own fate with equanimity, he felt a quiet fury at the way he had led his life. He saw that his joyful playing with money, so disassociated from any human reality, was his personal contribution to the Holocaust. He had been a part owner of General Electric and General Dynamic, both when he owned some of their stock and when he didn't. He never built a bomb or pushed a button, but he helped pay the men who did. It made his life pathetic. All his successes and failures now seemed so trivial compared to the big failure. All his aspirations so selfish compared to those he might have had, but didn't. But could men have done anything to stop the flow of events to the ultimate madness? Although he'd always thought they couldn't, though his reason even now argued they couldn't, that new voice from that strange detached world announced unreservedly that men could have stopped the flow of events as inefficiently, sporadically and bumblingly as they had set that flow of events in motion. The creative capacity for building rockets that occasionally blew up on their paths was equally capable of tearing them all apart and burying them, and could have done it with the same margin of error. Although it took a lot out of him to talk, and although Neil reminded him that every ounce of energy was needed, Frank was thankful that first Jean and then Neil let him say a few things he wanted to say. Jean was pale, puffy-eyed and dishevelled when he saw her, 30 hours after she'd begun taking care of Lisa and Jim. It seemed to Frank she was almost like a madwoman. When she came down into the main cabin and washed her hands and arms and then sat beside him for a moment, he smiled up at her. "You look like you're the one who got shot," he said. She looked startled and didn't smile. "I'm sorry Lisa's sick, Jean," he went on, aware that his strange levity was out of place with her now. "How are you, Frank?" she rejoined, finally centering attention on him. "Pretty good," he answered. "Even dying." "You're not dying, Frank," she said urgently. "It doesn't matter. Dying's not what it's cracked up to be," Frank went on, vaguely thinking he might be feverish, "and I'm sorry I butted in between you and Neil." "That's not important now." "I know it's not," Frank said, "but I still wanted to tell you. I'm sorry I can't love you the way you deserve." "Hell, Jean," Frank smiled. "I want to be loved a lot more than that." Again she looked at him questioningly, as if she were uncertain he was in his right mind. Then she smiled. "Thank you," she said, "for being the way you are." He felt a wave of weariness pass through him and then responded. "It's simple to become wise," he said. "Just get shot." The next day he and Neil talked. "We're only a day's sail away from the equator," Neil announced. Frank, whose weariness was increasing, and who now slept most of the time, opened his eyes to look at Neil. "You plan to bury me there?" "I hope to save you." Frank closed his eyes, nodded almost imperceptibly, then opened them again. "Too late, buddy." "Maybe," said Neil, "but we'll try." Frank struggled up into consciousness again. "I'm sorry I won't be round in Cape Horn with you." "Not very likely." "The sailing was always great," he said softly. "It was the human stuff that messed us up." As Neil looked down, Frank saw he had tears in his eyes. "You, me and the rest of the world," said Neil. "Yeah," said Frank. For another half-minute neither man spoke, and a series of confused images raced through Frank's mind until Neil rose to leave. "Last word," Frank mumbled, and Neil stopped. Frank opened his eyes and felt a strange giddy joy flowing through him. He smiled feverishly up at Neil. "Advice," he announced to Neil. "I think the market is at a low." He felt like laughing. "Good time to buy." Neil, like Jean, looked down at him uncertainly and then nodded, smiling slightly in return. "Nowhere to go but up," Neil commented. "Right," said Frank, closing his eyes. At dawn 2 days later, Frank died. Neil was surprised and unsettled by the grief he felt. He had known Frank was dying and thought he had hardened himself, but when Ollie called him down and he saw Frank's limp body and open mouth, an emptiness and gloom descended upon him that left him immobilized. He realized how much unspoken companionship he and Frank had enjoyed, even during the estranged period of the last month. To communicate in a shorthand about the way vagabonds sailed that Neil couldn't share with anybody else. To realise that he had lost his friend, first to jealousy and now to death, grieved him. Instead of giving Ollie orders about what to do, he wandered out of the cabin and walked aft to stare at the sea. A distant part of him felt the burden of having to tell Jane, but he felt passive, weary. He felt a sad, self-pitying sense that everything was useless, that death, like a cat playing with crippled mice, could take him and his loved ones at any time he wanted. A tickling on his cheeks and saltiness in the corner of his mouth made him realise he was crying. Jean came up to him. Seeing her eyes beaming with happiness, he realised that no one had told her about Frank's death. She didn't even notice his tears. "Neil," she said softly, the fever's down. I think it's breaking." Neil looked down at her, dazed, trying to absorb the meaning of the words. "Lisa?" Both of them, she announced softly, as if she were afraid that if she announced it too loudly the gods would change their mind. Jim 2 hours ago, and now Lisa, come and see. Mechanically, Neil followed her down into Frank's old cabin. The floor was wet, the room sweltering in the heat of the equator. Lisa lay wanly on the first berth, staring at him, a shy smile on her face, beads of perspiration or salt water all over her body. Jean adjusted a towel to hide Lisa's nakedness. I'm feeling better, Lisa said. I'm glad, said Neil simply, feeling tears for Frank and tears of joy for Lisa's recovery welling up in his eyes again. I'm hungry, Lisa announced uncertainly, as if she had finally isolated the unique sensation she was feeling. Neil nodded and reached out to put his hand briefly on hers. And Jean, smiling, pulled him further forward to see Jim, who was up on an elbow looking at him. Somehow Jim seemed to sense Neil's restrained mood. How is Dad? He said in a hoarse whisper. Neil, aware of Jean beside him, still exhilarated by the survival of the two young people, couldn't answer. I'm glad you came through, Jim, he said. But again Jim picked up Neil's unspoken feelings. Dad isn't... Yes, Neil. Frank died, Neil said, just about 20 minutes ago. After a moment's hesitation, Jim began to nod slowly. He said goodbye to me, Jim whispered hoarsely. He came to me an hour ago. His spirit, you know, and he told me to live, to take care of everyone. Neil nodded as Jean leaned against him, absorbing the news of Frank's death. He put his arm around her. Frank probably saved us all back during the mutiny, Neil said, and now we'll need you. But Jim now had tears in his eyes. But I wish, he began again in a weak voice from 3 days of disuse, I wish he could be with us if we finally live, Jean finished softly. Meow. Well, I hope you enjoyed this. There is 15 pages to go, which will be done in 2 episodes. It's a good book, and I do recommend you get it yourselves and read it. Bye. He felt a sad, self-pitying sense that everything was useless, that death, like a cat, played with the crippling mice, could not blah blah blah. The next day, he and Frank, oh dear God, pressing her face and mouth against Lisa's fresh, thank you doggy dogs. The two communicated in a shorthand way about, oh my God. The two communicated in a shorthand way about, fucking hell. The two communicated in a shorthand way about vagabonds sailed. The two communicated in a shorthand.